I'm very happy to introduce to you this afternoon our next speaker, Mr. Harper Wright. Now, Harper is a researcher, family history, but also in an academic sense through the University of Tasmania, in which he has studied the lifetime and career of one of the Australian Army Nursing Service sisters of the First World War. He came to one of our previous talks 2 years ago on nurses, and there were nearly 3,500 that we know of that served with the Australian or the Imperial Forces. A small cohort. It's much smaller, for example, than the men that served in the Australian Flying Corps. It's a far more cohesive group of women, all but one or two single young women serving their country overseas in the Australian and British forces. Harper Wright may appear to us to be American. It's very true that he was born there, but he is now an Australian citizen and a dinky guy Aussie. I asked him, what's that badge you're wearing, Harper? And I looked closely and it said Gallipoli on it. And I asked, what is that? He said he participated in the 2014 Gallipoli March in the centre of London. So that shows his credentials, doesn't it? And he's here, I think from Barrel you've come? Yeah, with your good wife, Mrs. Wright, I'll say. And he's been so patient, as have the other speakers today, and I appreciate their cooperation and patience. Please join me in welcoming Harper Wright to speak to us about one of our own.
Thank you, Paul. Well, good afternoon. I came by Gallipoli, Radcliff, Barking in Tasmania, and I put courage, confusion, and chaos. I almost put collision with misogyny too, but I thought that might be a bit too much of a. No, it's fine. No. Okay, I'll speak a little bit. I'll stand here and won't wander around. Anyway, back 2021 to 2024, 25, I did a diploma in family history from the University of Tasmania. It was in the middle of COVID and I could do it by distance learning online. Had its advantages, had its disadvantages, but I got through it. And for the final unit, I had to do an essay on a First World War, Second World War person who I hadn't researched before. So that took out most of Janet's family out of the equation. It left one Austrian count on my mother's side who served in the First World War in the Imperial Austrian Army. But I didn't speak very good German, so I decided I'd give him a pass. So it came down to Janetella. As one of the podcasts I often listen to, this sort of byline is not AI, it's genuinely human, and this is really what this is all about. This is my own research, digging into it and finding out, I hate to say, a number of, should I call them, alternative facts. I won't say they're actually errors, and one of the ones that I look at is the Australian War Memorials. It's a good place to start when you generally start. But if you look at this one, there are at least 2 errors and 2 questionable facts in this one. First of all, she sailed from Hobart, she sailed from Hobart on that day in 1914. How did she enlist and sail on the same day? No, she didn't. She actually enlisted on the 11th of August. We'll get to that. Second is, some army clerk somewhere along the line decided to give her an extra E to the end of her name. And if you look through her file in the National Archives, at least half the letters in there relate to people writing, do we have a sister Radcliff with a T? Do we have a sister Radcliffe with an E? And these letters go back and say, no, we don't have any Radcliffe or Radcliffes with an E, but we have one without an E. But still, a lot of the forms and even the Roman world still call her Radcliffe with an E. So that's an error there. I consider it to be an error, the E and the enlistment date. The return to Australia date, I also question. She came back as a nurse in charge of the nursing staff on a hospital ship from England in 1919. She had 513, I think it was, patients, invalids on that ship. Did she really have an easy return home? I think her return to Australia should be the date she got back to Hobart and could finally collapse. And she was never head sister. All the records show her as temporary head sister. She was temporary head sister for about 15 months. I don't know how temporary you have to be a temporary head sister. So I found I couldn't really rely on those. And then I also started reading the books off my shelf that I bought years ago and decided I would start reading those. And this was one of them, Anzac's Dirty Dozen. Unfortunately, I really got upset at the beginning of this because in one of the chapters by Eleanor Hancock, she wrote, the development of the notion that Australian women somehow managed to make an important contribution to the Australian war effort in the two world wars is a lingering and powerful myth. Now, that, I hope there's no Eleanor Hancock in the room. She's a lecturer or something at the University of New South Wales. She is an Australian woman that wrote that. Anyway, I hope to disprove that in this thing. I must say, thanks to a number of ladies who helped me greatly. There was Nicole Blay and Janet Pelosi, whose article on the first Australian auxiliary hospital in Harefield was very useful. And there was Kirsty Harris that did a good bunch of work on it. And a lady on the Great War Forum called Frev. I don't know what her real name is, but she goes by the name of Frev on the Great War Forum. And she was a great help to me too. So thanks to all of those.
Heather Ford, I think.
Heather Ford?
Heather Ford, I think you're talking about.
That's great source of knowledge on nursing and so on. Anyway, to talk about Janet Radcliff. Her parents were Hamilton Radcliffe, and he was manager or actuary, depending on which record you look on, of the Hobart Savings Bank. Still there on Murray Street today, and that's a picture there. But back then, Hobart was a town of about 40 to 50,000 people, so fairly small, and she had some connections to families such as the Giblins, the Maxwells, and Crowders, and also, we've heard about today, Charles Bean. Charles Bean was a cousin of hers. She was born in 1883, so she was about 31 when the war started, and she was 31. After being educated at Hobart Girls' School, and interesting enough, after Hobart Girls' School, she matriculated at the University of Tasmania, but she didn't finish that, and she never graduated, but she went into nursing training, and I was wondering, because her father died unexpectedly of a heart attack in 1909, somebody had to earn a living for the family, so she switched from an academic career at the university to go into nursing training and earn a living there. Then in 1914, she was offered a job at the Moulong Private Hospital, which is east. East that way?
West.
Well,
East is
east
the way.
that way. Over towards, a bit over there. I don't think it's there anymore, but yeah. Well, she was offered the job in early August 1914 to be head nurse at the hospital there, but she declined that and enlisted in the war effort. And interesting enough, all she had to do was go down and see her uncle, who was the principal medical officer for Hobart, and sign the papers and join the nursing service. But this is, I think, where her problem starts, because everything was so quick and so unorganized at that stage. Her actual file at the National Archives doesn't start until 1916. If you look at anything, it'll say that she, suddenly appeared almost out of the woodwork in 1916, but she did that. She joined with another lady who was a couple of weeks before, or a week before, because they both did that first week of the war, Alice Gordon King. Alice Gordon King was a nurse about 2 years younger than Janet, and they both enlisted from Tasmania, and they were the Tasmanian nurses in the first convoy. Now here in this picture here, if you look down in this corner here, you see a Red Cross flag there, and two ladies with, well, two hats there, and I believe that those are the nursing hats with the Red Cross flag there. And that's HM Geelong, which was the ship, the transport that took the 12th Battalion and some field battery and a few other troops from Hobart to Melbourne to Albany, where they met up with the rest of the First Fleet, the first convoy. And they sailed with the first convoy. Now, apparently, according to their notes, nurses were not included in the first contingent as it was drawn up. And it's only as a later thought that they actually get included. And it was good that they did, because when they sailed, they did three things mainly. They trained the orderlies. Now, the Army orderlies for the regiment and for the field hospital, field ambulances, could have been a butcher, a baker, or a candlestick maker in previous life and had no medical training. And the two nurses trained these orderlies on the way over. And they also administered vaccinations, because they all had to have vaccinations for enteric fever and something else. But they did that. So that's what they did when they sailed. And Alice King and Janet Radcliff actually went on board from about the 20th of September on the Geelong and told the carpenters how to build the cupboards and fit out the nursing area so that things were available and reachable when they actually sailed. They treated patients that had at least one appendectomy on the trip. And as I said, if there had been no medical staff, what would have happened to these patients? They actually ended up with a 33-bed clinic there, which was generally about half full. While they were sailing, the first thing that happened was that the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the powers, the Central Powers, mainly because Britain had taken two battleships that had been built for the Ottoman Empire and used them for their own purposes. They didn't like that. And then they met the Emden. After sailing from Albany up to, they were heading to Ceylon, Sri Lanka now, and they met the Emden, and then they arrived in Egypt. These are Sister Alice Gordon King on the left and Sister Janet Radcliff on the right on the ship as they were sailing. And there's the Emden as she was in her full power. And if you just go down towards Oxford Street, you will see one of the guns from the Emden is down there on the corner of Liverpool Street when it turns into Oxford Street. When they got to India, sorry, that's my family. When they got to Egypt, they disembarked in Alexandria, took the train up to Cairo, and then went to the Mina Hospital, which is just outside of Cairo, near the pyramids. And apparently they had a good time there. And they were in Mina from the beginning of December till the sort of middle of January. And then they were transferred to a hospital, a station on the Suez Canal at Ismailia, however you pronounce it. And while they were there, the Turks came across the Sinai and attacked the British. I use the wider word there, British, because they were Indian, they were British, they were Australians, they were New Zealanders who were defending the Suez Canal. And that's where they, I wouldn't say they were shelled in the hospital, but they got some near misses. And then later on they went out and could see the battle damage after the Turks had retreated again. And they had their first death there. It was a New Zealand lad. I should say at this stage, I should have said earlier, the best source of information I actually found about this was after I finished my paper, which was in the Army Museum in Hobart, the diary of Alice Gordon King from 1914, 1915, which gives a lot of information and quite detailed. And then there's also in the Tasmanian archives, there's another document which was co-written by Alice Gordon King and Janet Radcliff about their experiences during the war. And so, for instance, if you want to know what ships were in harbor when they entered a harbor, it'll tell you. If you want to know how long it took them to sail from Anzac Cove to Alexandria or Malta or wherever they were sailing to, you can tell from the diary because it's ended day by day. If you want to know how they actually felt about things, the papers in the Tasmanian archive are the best source. We don't have any letters from Janet Radcliffe, but the notes in the archive are the best ones there. In April, they were ordered to board the HMHS, His Majesty's Oswald ship Sicilia. Sicilia was an interesting ship. It had been a P&O ship, and it was staffed by doctors from the Indian Medical Service, and the crew were mainly Indian, and the stewards and the orderlies were all Indians. And there was a story I read once, and I can't remember where it was, I can't find it now, but it wasn't relevant when I was writing the paper, so I didn't keep it. But there was an officer that went on board Sicilia as a patient, and he said, I was really lucky I got a cabin to myself. And he said, then the problem started. The steward came and said, what would you like for dinner, sir? And he said, what do you like for dinner? Oh, well, we have curry, so we have curry, that kind of thing. What would you like to drink, sir? Well, I haven't been on, Gallipoli for 3 weeks. I haven't had a decent glass of water in 3 weeks. Can I have some water? No, sir. Water is very restricted at the moment, but we have plenty of champagne. So there were the good parts and bad parts of it. And also on the Sicilia, there was a Melbourne surgeon. I don't know if any of you know Surgeon Bird, Mr. Bird. In my day, surgeons were always called Mr. Bird, because he went to war and he volunteered his staff to the Imperial Service, not to the Australian Service, but the Imperial Service. So he took 4 nurses from his Melbourne hospital with him to war, and they were serving on the Sicilia when our sisters King and Radcliff got there. I'd love to know more about him. I tried to do some research on him, I couldn't really find that much, but I'm sure there's a good story in there somewhere. There's not many people travel to war with 4 nurses. Anyway, they went to Alexandria, and from there they went up to Mudros, on the island of Lemnos, and then in the diaries and in the notes they talk about watching the boats go out on the 24th, 25th of April. And they said we didn't know what was happening, we just saw the boats leaving. And they had obviously got quite attached to the 12th Battalion, who was on their ship, the Geelong, when they came over from Hobart, because they referred to them as ours. They never referred to them as the 12th Battalion again, they always referred to them just as ours. But anyway, on the first days, they went to Cape Helles, where the British and French had landed, and the first thing that comes clear when you start reading about that was how totally and catastrophically underprepared they were. I mean, we know that the military side was catastrophically underprepared for what would happen. The medical side, I think, was worse. These ships that should have 400 people on had upwards of 1,000 lying in corridors and anywhere they could lie just to get them off the beaches. And it was fairly disastrous. The other thing is they write about was the fact that the troops were coming off the beaches still in the clothes they had on, the mud, the lice, everything else. These troops had no sort of clean-up time in the casualty clearing stations or anything like that. They were just coming straight onto the boats and bringing all that. It was so bad that the first trip they made from Cape Helles, they went up to Mudros to disembark the patients there, but they were turned away because all the hospitals in Mudros were full, so they sailed to Alexandria. They got to Alexandria, all the hospitals in Alexandria were full, so they were sent to Malta. So probably sort of a 2-week trip that if they'd known in advance, they could have done it in 4 or 5 days. By the 21st of May, they were now operating off of Anzac Cove, supporting the Australians. And they did that, and things calmed down generally. They got down to the point where they were supposed to have 400 patients, and they actually had 400 patients, and they could leave, and another ship was coming in. The only problem with the ships coming in was there were 2 types of ships. There was the white ships, which were the hospital ships. Hospital ships were made white with a green band around them and a green cross, which didn't necessarily save them from enemy attack, but could have. And then there were the black ships. And the black ships were just basically transport ships, cargo ships that had brought horses or whatever from Egypt or wherever they were coming from, and were just used to put patients on to take them off and take them away. So the patients on the black ships didn't have any nursing care or medical care at all. They were just put on board and sailed off to Mudros or Alexandria, wherever they were going. In August 1916, the Sicilia was moved on the Suez to Bombay route, taking wounded Indian troops back to India. So King and Radcliff were transferred from the Sicilia to the Gallipoli castle. And in addition to serving the troops on Gallipoli and the Dardanelles, they also started going up to Salonika to bring troops away from there back to Alexandria, Malta, or wherever they had to go. I think the first trip they made on the Gallipoli castle, if I remember correctly, they went back to England. They even went as far as taking wounded people back there. in the diary there, or no, in the notes they wrote, our staff was ridiculously inadequate. We just tried to do the most essential things, and it was hard at times to judge which things could and could not be left. In remembering that first trip to Gallipoli, it seems like one long moan of agony. 500 badly wounded men with a staff of 5 medical officers and 8 trained women, 12 orderlies, which anyone can see was hopefully inadequate staff to cope with such numbers of severely wounded men. And needless to say, we could hardly bear to leave our wards, even for the 3 hours that our matron insisted on that we take off each 24 hours. So these nurses were working, what she said, 21 hours a day. So it was pretty tough. And the other quote I like was from Philomena Badsey in an article called Caregiving and Naval Nurses in Gallipoli. She said, the most difficult and demanding nursing care given in the service during the First World War was carried out on hospital ships which evacuated sick and wounded from the Gallipoli Peninsula. So this was no picnic. It was hard on the troops. And thinking back to that talk we had earlier about the 3,000, 4,000, whatever the correct number is, of wounded from Mel, those men needed nursing care too. So think about, the life, the interesting part of a soldier's life doesn't end when he gets wounded. It continues much more on afterwards and when he's being treated and how he's being treated. I mean, my wife's grandfather, just a quick story here, he was wounded in October 1917 in the Battle of Brucine Bridge in the 3rd Heat. And he got a blighty. And blighty, as you may know, is a wound that gets you back to England. His blighty was so bad that he didn't get back to England until the 21st of February 1918. It took him 5 months to get back to England after his blighty. So, pay attention to what happens to the wounded, because this is an interesting story as anything else. This is a fine picture which I found of the Grand Tule Castle. There you see the green stripe, the Red Cross, and it's the Aquitanian apparently in the background there in the Harper on Lemnos. And I said they were going up to Salonika. Now this is the SS Marquette, and this is an example of the black ship. Now this black ship was transporting the 2nd New Zealand hospital up to Salonika, and it got torpedoed off of Salonika. It was not actually a hospital ship at that time. It was a ship that was transporting a hospital, because they were going up to be a land-based hospital. So it's a bit, dubious. In many ways, it can be considered a legitimate target because it was a cargo ship. Nothing to show that it was a hospital ship. And the nurses that survived this sinking were put onto the Grand Tule Castle, which we were just saying, and they took them back to Alexandria. And they actually supplied a lot of the nurses on the Grand Tule Castle supplied their own hair. I think hairpins was one of the things she mentioned mainly. Clothing and hairpins and things like that to the nurses that they had rescued from the sinking of the Marquette. In 1916, Gallipoli had been evacuated in December 1915, and so the only sort of theater that was really active at that stage was Salonika. And the nurses were then first called back to Australian services in April 1916. At the end of the Gallipoli campaign, General Maxwell wrote a report, and he acknowledged the services of Alice King and Janet Radcliff, and they got their mention in dispatches there. In a number of articles written about them, it says they got it for work at Abbeville. They didn't get to Abbeville until March 1917. So I don't see how the report could be, the mentioned factors could be there when General Maxwell did sort of specifically mention Gallipoli in the report. On returning to England, they were they were first attached to the 3rd Australian Hospital. This was in Egypt. They were in the 3rd Australian Hospital, and transferred to England on the Gallica. That's the Gallica. And the Gallica was sunk by mines at Lahore later on in 1916. And they were posted first to the Australian Auxiliary Hospital, and then to the 3rd Australian General Hospital. In one of the books I read, one paragraph was a nurse complaining that she was being sent to an auxiliary hospital as opposed to a general hospital. She wanted a general hospital, which she thought would be more challenging than an auxiliary hospital. An auxiliary hospital were mainly convalescent hospitals, but they still had full operating theaters and things, because the troops would go from the battlefield to a regimental aid post, to a field ambulance, to a casualty clearing station, to a hospital, and as soon as they were well enough to leave the hospital, they were discharged from the hospital. That didn't mean they still needed care. So you have a question? No? So I thought, sorry, hand waving. Sorry. And so this nurse was writing in this letter saying, I'm being sent to the 1st Australian Auxiliary Hospital. I really wanted to go to the 3rd General Hospital where I get real work. But that's the Gallica, which they went from the Mediterranean back to England in July 1916. This is also interesting, because I also read another bit where I was on the Great War Forum, and somebody wrote that his grandfather went back with a wounded, broken jaw on the Gallica as a patient on this trip. So obviously they were transporting nurses back as well as taking patients as well. In 1917, they finished at the 3rd Australian General Hospital in Brighton. Must have been a pretty bleak place. It had been a workhouse originally. And if any of you know your British Victorian history, there weren't many more bleak places in the world than a workhouse. And they handed it over to the Canadians. On the 11th of April, they went across the Channel to France on the Londonderry. She had been a Scotland to Northern Ireland ferry, and then was used as a transport across the Channel. They were then posted to the 2nd Stationary Hospital. And I say they here so much because Alice King and Janet Radcliff seemed to go posting to posting together. I don't know if it was sort of, it's one coin here, Janet Radcliffe one side, Alice King the other. They just go together and they went. And so they went to the 2nd Stationary Hospital, and then to the 1st Casualty Clearing Station at Tasmania Camp. This was sort of just back from the Ypres battlefront, and a lot of the patients they had were either from Polygon Wood or from, I suppose the whole Battery front there. They were attacked once by an airplane. They said one day some Hun hate was dealt out to us in the shape of shells, one of which fell in the center of the hospital grounds near where an ambulance were loading. Fortunately, was the dud of the day. No lives were lost, and the ground was solved. At the end of this posting here in 1917, at Tasmania Camp, the first cavalry clearing station, the duo of Sisters King and Radcliff was broken because Sister King married Colonel Elliot, Charles Elliot, of the 12th Battalion. And because she married, that was a disgraceful thing to do, she married, she had to resign her commission and was out of the army. Though she did continue to serve because she served as a volunteer at the 1st Australian Auxiliary Hospital when she returned to England because she wasn't going to sit by and do nothing while her husband went back to France. And when she got there, her sister had been posted. Her sister was the masseuse. And apparently, interesting to read, you don't really think of masseuses and masseuses in this context, but what they wrote about in one of the notes was the fact that nurses got the body semi-fit, I'm going to say, but the masseuses got the body flexible so they could go back into service. And when you think about it, what actually was happening at this stage was these medical staff had one job, was to get the patient in and get the patient out. And when the patient went out, there was only two routes for them. One was going back to the front, the other was going home to Australia, because they were unfit. And this, I often wonder, which was the better option, did you want a really bad blighting so you got returned to Australia, or did you want a not so bad blighting so you got 3 months in England and then you went back to the front again? It must have been difficult for them. The rest of 1918 was a fairly quiet time. This is when, at the Australian Auxiliary Hospital, was when she was temporary head sister. She was there, and that's the hospital there. She was there all of 1918. And in the middle, of course, there was the influenza pandemic, could be called the Spanish flu pandemic, although Spain can't be blamed for it. And her sister, Helen Cecily Radcliff, got influenza quite badly and was shipped to the nursing home for nurses, which was in South Kensington, very near the Natural History Museum in South Kensington in London. In 1918, John Radcliffe would have qualified for what was called Anzac Leave. And I've never heard about Anzac Leave before, did some research on it. And all troops that had served in 1914, 1915, those at Anzac, were entitled to return to Australia for a period. And when you include the voyages both ways, it came out to almost 6 months. Well, needless to say, the powers that be in the British Army didn't want to lose troops for 6 months, and they really resisted this idea that it was being promoted by the Prime Minister Billy Hughes here. There's no record in Janet's file that she was even considered for Anzac Leave, or offered it, or was qualified for it. Her brother, who was in the 5th Light Horse on Gallipoli, he actually, his file says that he was on one of the first boats coming back in December 1918, and it has on his form marked Anzac Leave. That's the only reference I found to it in all the people I've looked at. In Anne Donald was the nurse who Paul talked about 2 years ago at a lecture here. In her book, she referred to the most delightful Xmas and not one unhappy face at Airfield. That was after the It was after the armistice, of course, and one of the great nephews of Janet Radcliff in Tasmania has a bowl made from sort of trencher, I'll call it, a sort of brass bowl, and it's inscribed to Sister Radcliffe from her friend, Xmas 1918. So that must have been from one of her patients there in Harper. Now this picture is an expansion of the little bit down there, and I believe that is Janet Radcliffe. It matches the picture of her on the Geelong and every other picture I've seen. But you can see here, you know, it gives a good example of the type of cases, you know, at least 3 people there on crutches or canes or whatever. And during I read the unit diaries, and in the unit diaries, from probably June onwards, there was a concerted effort to replace nurses with voluntary aid detachment people as volunteers in the UK. A, because they were cheaper, and B, because if they could get a VAD in to do something, the nurse could do something, and that might relieve an orderly, and an orderly they'd send back to the front. So there was a real concerted effort, you know, money pinching and so on is not a modern thing. One of the examples, another example of sort of misogyny that I came across was in the unit diaries, whenever an officer came in or out of a unit, he was always, you know, captain, lieutenant, whatever, taking on strength, struck on strength, whichever words they used, and that one marched out or whatever. Nurses are simply 18 nurses marched out, not a name. And in the Australian system, nurses were supposed to be the equivalent of officers. They have pips. If you look through there in the display exhibition hall, you'll see a mannequin of a nurse with I think it's one of the stone statues in there of a nurse with pips on her cape because she was considered, you know, lieutenant. We got paid at the rate of a sergeant. So they got paid as a sergeant, so her return to Australia date was given as the 18th of January 1919 when she marched out of the auxiliary hospital. They went to HT Marga, which Alan Donald, who was on the same ship, fortunately, she gives me a little bit about it, described it as a perfect little beauty. There were 10 nurses on board. They had asked for more nurses to be available when they got to Alexandria to bolster the nursing staff, because none, I don't think there were any available in Alexandria, so they went on. I said, Janet Radcliffe was head sister in charge of the nursing staff, and she had 600 patients. Fortunately, she had her sister, Helen Cecily, on as masseuse on the boat, so she had some companionship coming back. It was a job well done because this was still in the aftermath of the influenza pandemic. The ship was declared clean when it got to Australia, so there was no quarantine problems. And Donald says it was a happy trip for the things. She said here. I don't know, but she said she made a comment that it was hard to say goodbye to the other nurses, especially to sweetest Janet, who made it a happy trip for all of us. When they got to Hobart, eventually on the 9th of March, they had a quite a riotous, raucous welcome. They were met, and the nurses were put in a car, and the car was not driven to town hall. It was pushed up the road by the servicemen returning, and the mayor called her a real Anzac, which was a good trip. And then she was unjustly dismissed by the military district. Military district, now I don't know about dismissals and discharges, whatever you want to call it, whether it was something you were wanted and you were urging for, or whether you didn't want it. I mean, you know, a job in, you know, nursing service wasn't bad, I don't think. But they discharged her on schedule for something like the 15th of May. But fortunately, the principal matron did write a letter and said, this is totally unjust. This person is ill, is still undergoing medical treatment for her heart condition, which was a result of her war work, and she should not be discharged until her medical treatment is finished. And so amazingly enough, I had seen a letter which actually from the medical district saying, "You made a mistake." I mean, that was an amazing letter. I mean, it's probably one of the few in military history that's ever happened. And she wasn't discharged until November. There was another bit in the papers where she applied for a warm uniform allowance of £8, and it was denied because she was not in France in the winter of 1916-1917. She was in England instead, so they wouldn't give her a warm uniform allowance. I don't think an Australian uniform would have been very good in England after 3 years. This is the plaque in St. David's Cathedral in Hobart, and last line says, with the gallantry and devotion to duty which won for her mention in dispatches from Gallipoli and the place of honor in the hearts of all who knew her. Well, I think that's wrong again, because from my reading, she did not make one mention in dispatches, but two. And I'll show you in a second. So it's a very nice plaque there, very honors her. This is not very legible, but I'll read it for you. Up here, it says TH System, Temporary Head System, First AAH, First Australian Auxiliary Hospital. Brought to the notice of the Secretary of War for valuable service rendered. Now, if it's saying she was temporary head sister at the hospital, that cannot be the same mention in dispatches that she had received for the work at Gallipoli, which was was gazetted in June 1916. So I think she should have two mentions in dispatches. Unfortunately, the Australian War Memorial only gives her credit for one of them. So thank you very much. If you would like a copy of the essay, or if you have any questions or want copies of any of the documents, please feel free to email me. Yes?
I'd just like to get a handle on how the nursing service was administered, in that it's not in the it's not in the role of battle, so it's outside of that. It's not within the field hospital or whatever. Where does it come in? How does it fit?
Well, it was a...
So it's not in the order of battle?
No, it's not in the order of battle, and there was debate early on whether it was part of the army or not. Because there was some saying that it wasn't part of the army. It was a separate organization on the side of the army. And the other thing is that, you know, when you look at most of them, you know, when you see people, you know, if I go back to Alice King, she was quite a kid. Well, how many more minutes do I have? Oh, do I have a few more minutes?
I'd like you to go on and there may be a second question.
Yeah, okay. When you look at most of the nurses, there was staff nurse, there was sister, and then you went to matron. And the thing about being a matron in the Australian system is you had to have midwifery. And when Janet Radcliff finally was well enough, she went back to Melbourne and was training as a midwife in Melbourne when she died in November 2022 because she couldn't become a matron of a hospital until she had midwifery. So I'm not sure, no matter how good Janet Radcliff was, if she could have actually been a matron in the nursing service because she didn't have midwifery. You know, it's very hard to see. And there was sort of two ranks of, there was matron and there was principal matron, and I think that's it. And so the principal matron, who was in charge of the nursing service, was only the equivalent of about a major. Yes. Yes?
I've read that there were a number of women that wanted to go and help the Australian soldiers, but they couldn't do it here in Australia. So they volunteered, they went over to England and became VAD. And that's the only way that they could do the nursing to assist Australian soldiers. So when did the Australian Army nurses form?
Well, they formed just after the South African War, I believe.
Right.
And they were a contingent up until 1914 of, I'm going to say, no more than 50 or 60 nurses, because there wasn't that much. And then what you had was the nurses, you had to be single, you had to have at least 3 years of hospital training and 1 or 2 other qualifications. You generally had to be a good character and middle class, effectively, if you were going to do this. And then you could join the Australian Army Nursing Service. Some went over to join the VADs. Some went over to join the Queen Alexander's Imperial Nursing Service. And some went and served in France in the French Army, and what were called the Bluebirds. And they were another way that they did. Another aunt, my wife's, she was on holiday in England when the war broke out. So she was an Australian who volunteered for the Voluntary Aid Detachment and served in England and in northern France during the war. Yeah.
Did she die from her heart condition?
Yes, she did. Yeah, she died in her sleep in Melbourne of heart condition, and her uncle, Colonel Gibbon, said that it was definitely due to war. He was a doctor, so it was definitely due to war service. Yes?
That was my question.
That was your question, yeah. Oh, thank you very much, Paul.
Can I say that one of the researchers that my good friend Harper referred to is in the audience today, and that's Janet Pies.
Speaker. Microphone.
Janet Pies is here, and she is one of the researchers that Harper referred to. Here's a thank you for you. It's a great honour to have you speak today.
Yeah.
It was very good.